So the last topic for us to talk about in this unit, which again was about reproduction and genetics. So we've talked about how cells reproduce in the chromosomes, talked about some basic genetics. The last section for us to talk about is the molecules that make our genes and our alleles. So the genetic information, which I'm sure you know is DNA. So we're going to talk here about DNA, what it is, what the molecules look like, how does it have information about us, and how is that information used. So to start, let's talk a little bit about mutations. So when you hear that word, what do you think about?
When the body changes unnaturally, like you have something that's like wrong.
Okay.
Like, something that like in your genes or DNA, I guess there's like an error and it makes something weird on your body.
So that's a good way to think of it. A mutation, the simplest definition for a mutation is it is a change in the genetic material. So we have genes in our DNA. And sometimes that DNA can change. Different things can happen. And if the DNA changes, the traits that DNA codes for may also change. So that's what a mutation is. Basically a change in the DNA. Every time a cell reproduces or copies itself, there's a chance that kind of a mistake happens. A letter in the DNA code gets changed, gets substituted, gets added or deleted. And those are the things that we call mutations. And so usually mutations can cause something not to work properly. For example, a mutation in the gene that codes for growth hormone might affect it so that the growth hormone doesn't work properly anymore and can cause a disease or some problem. Other times, a mutation, a change, might actually result in a new trait that's actually helpful, right? That might help an organism to survive better. And those traits might be favored through evolution. But mutations only can be passed on to the next generation if they happen in sex cells, if they happen in gametes. If a mutation happens in the skin cell of an organism, for example, that's not going to be passed on to the next generation. Only changes to the DNA of the sperm and egg cells can go on to the next generation. There are instances, and we already learned about them when we talked about karyotypes, when actually the number of chromosomes can change. When cells are dividing in meiosis, if the chromosomes don't separate properly, you could end up with a sperm cell or an egg cell that has an extra chromosome or is missing a chromosome. Those are called chromosome mutations. Okay? And we talked about Down syndrome as the most common example of a chromosome alteration that affects people. And again, Down syndrome is caused by an extra 21st chromosome. So if a cell has an extra 21st chromosome, it combines during fertilization, it could lead to an embryo that has that extra chromosome. Some of the others you learned about, Klinefelter syndrome with an extra X chromosome, Turner syndrome, when an individual has only one X chromosome. Those are all examples of chromosome differences when the chromosomes don't separate properly. We call that non-disjunction. Other times it's the actual gene, the DNA itself that's changing. We call these gene mutations. Okay? This is a random change. Yeah, you have a couple things to write here. This is a random change, Logan, we're in the DNA basis. sometimes, so the DNA code is a series of letters that we'll learn about today. A's, T's, G's, and C's. And these letters can change. They can, one letter can be substituted for another. A new letter can be inserted into the code. One letter could be deleted from the code. These are all possible changes that can happen. These are the words we have for them. An addition is when a new letter gets put into the DNA by accident. A deletion is when one letter in the DNA code gets removed. A substitution is when one letter is substituted for another. And all of those things can change the information that those genes are coding for. Some things can increase the chances of a mutation happening. Certain types of radiation, for example, ultraviolet radiation, can damage the DNA of cells and cause mutations to happen. This is one of the reasons why we wear sunscreen, because ultraviolet radiation in the sun's rays can damage the DNA in our skin. And what can it cause to happen?
Because
What is
sunburn?
Sunburn and repeatedly
Sun cancer.
can lead to skin cancer, because repeatedly exposing our skin to these ultraviolet radiations can increase our risk that our cells can become cancerous, that they can lose control of cell division. Some other examples: albinism.
It's where you turn into a albino. Everything about you is white. Like
So usually it's not turn into. Somebody's usually born with this condition, albinism. Or having the condition of being albino means a mutation has happened, okay, due to one letter in the DNA being changed. And it leads to that person not being able to produce melanin. Melanin is a pigment that gives our skin and hair color. It's protective also against ultraviolet radiation.
That's why they can't go in the sun most of the
And
time.
so sometimes a person, if they have this mutation, their skin doesn't produce any pigment, their eyes don't have any pigment, their hair, okay, and they could be at a higher risk of damage from the sun's rays because they don't have that protective element. There's other examples. The peppered moths, you remember we studied in evolution. A change in the DNA of these moths can change the coloration of them. We learned about the pocket mouse that lived on the rocks. Yeah. And on the lava flows, over time they became darker in color. That's because of variation in their fur color that could have been due to a mutation. We also know that it's not just genes and DNA that determine the traits of an organism. The environment is what we say for outside factors can also influence the expression of our genes, how our genes are translated into our traits. Twins, for example. Do identical twins? Does anyone know identical twins?
Well, they're just born identical. They look exactly the same.
But sometimes identical twins have some slight differences.
Their smell,
and so those different identical twins have the exact same genes. That's the definition of identical twins. But because other factors come into play, outside factors, environment, foods that we experiences can also influence our traits. And so identical twins might have differences that come about because of other factors. Does anyone recognize these twins?
They're from The Shining. They're like, come play with us, Daddy. Come play with us.
Yeah, they're creepy twins from The Shining.
I love that movie. I've never seen it, but
Here's another example. This is an interesting one. This is the Himalayan rabbit. This rabbit generally has light fur, but if you strap an ice pack to its back for a while, what happens to its fur?
It turns black.
Yes, it starts to produce more pigment in its fur, and its fur in that area become darker. So this is outside factors like the ice pack are influencing how the traits are being expressed. And something about this ice pack causes certain genes to turn on, giving it darker fur in those areas. Here are some seeds that germinated in different color light. When they're in white light, the gene for chlorophyll is turned on. And when they're in other colors, it gets turned off. So outside factors influence the DNA. And so a question we often have is, well, what parts of our own characteristics, if we think about humans, what parts of my traits and characteristics are genetic and which are not, which come from other places? Like, is the fact that I really like broccoli, is that a genetic factor?
No, I don't think so.
Or is it just something,
It's just something you like.
right, things in our lives, like our personality? Is our personality genetic?
No.
Are there some aspects that might be?
Maybe.
Maybe. So one interesting thing that scientists do to try to study this is they look at identical twins. Sometimes identical twins can be adopted by different parents and raised completely separate from each other. And these are very interesting to scientists because identical twins have the same genes, same DNA. But if they're raised completely separate, then we can look at how they're different. And that can give us some ideas. For example, if these identical twins were adopted separately and they both love broccoli, what might that tell us about their preferences for food?
They're the same.
That it might be genetic.
Yeah.
Or what if one loves to read, one doesn't love to read? What would that tell us about things like our preference for reading? Is it genetic or is it something else?
Something else.
Right, because they have the same genes. So scientists look at these identical twins adopted separately to help them understand what traits are coded for in our genes and what traits are determined by other outside factors, environmental factors.
So it could be the same gene, but just opposite personality?
Could be. And so probably though, the reality is lots of these are both, right? Maybe some aspects of our personality are inherited from our parents, but there's also environmental factors and experiences that we have through our lifetime that also affect those things. And so lots of these, like for example, height. Is your height genetic?
Yes.
Yeah, probably a large part of it is genetic. But if, as you grow up, if you don't have great nutrition, right? If you, then those things can affect how tall you actually get. So maybe our maximum potential height is genetic, but things that happen in your childhood and as you're growing might affect that as well. So that's an example of a combination of genetic and environmental factors.
Also, it's triplets.
What's that?
Triplets.
Triplets are formed, yeah, like identical twins or fraternal twins, the same way.
But yeah, they're the same.
It's just three. So, like if a woman's ovaries release 3 eggs at once during ovulation, and all 3 get fertilized by 3 different sperm cells, and they all implant and grow, she'll be pregnant with triplets. But if they wouldn't be identical.
Don't forget quadruplets and the others.
And lots of times those, like 4 or 5 multiple births, are often when a woman might be on a fertility treatment. Sometimes when women are not having difficulty having children, there may be fertility treatments in which medicine, a hormone a woman can take that encourages her ovaries to release eggs. If she's unable to get pregnant because of a lack of ovulation, certain medications can increase ovulation. But it could almost work too well, and she could ovulate and release 4 or 5 eggs. And if they get fertilized, then she might be pregnant with 4 or 5 embryos. All right. So lots of human diseases and disorders are caused by mutations. Don't worry too much, but here are some examples. PKU, phenylketonuria, is a genetic disease that happens because of just a single enzyme that is not produced correctly. It's caused by a recessive allele. Sickle cell disease, another genetic disease that's caused by a single recessive gene, causes the blood cells to be misshapen, especially in low oxygen conditions. It can lead to people having attacks in which these blood cells sort of build up and block the flow of blood to different parts of the body, leading to pain or damage to certain organs. Tay-Sachs disease is another one that affects enzymes. But these are genetic diseases when the genetic code, one single difference can lead to serious impacts to a person's health. So let's talk a little bit about our genes. So we know, where are our genes located?
Your body.
In our body. Let's be more specific. Where in our body? Let's go hold on to that idea for a minute, Angelina. Where in our body? In our cells. Where in our cells?
Your DNA. Nucleus.
In the nucleus. Where in the nucleus? Chromosomes. What are they made of? DNA. So, in our body, all of our cells have a nucleus. In that nucleus are chromosomes. Those chromosomes are made of DNA, and that is where our traits are stored, our genes, our alleles. They're in the chromosomes. They're made of DNA. And so DNA is our heredity. It's our genetic code. It's responsible for telling our body how to make proteins. Anybody know what DNA stands for?
Yeah, me too. I knew what it means.
What is it, Andrew?
Unfortunately, I have the answers on here,
It's okay.
so we'll just go ahead and say deoxyribonucleic acid.
Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful. Deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA. Deoxyribonucleic acid. That's what DNA stands for. It's a chemical. It's a molecule. It's a large molecule. And we'll talk about what it's made of, the parts of the DNA molecule. There's also another type of nucleic acid that's really important in our genetic code. That's called RNA. We'll learn about what that does tomorrow. RNA stands for ribonucleic acid. It's a slightly different type of molecule. So DNA is in our nucleus. There's also some in other parts of the cells. It's made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And it's a very, very large molecule. Okay. And it takes on a unique shape, like that you probably recognize. When I show you this picture, you probably know instantly that this is what?
DNA.
That's DNA. And you could recognize that because of the shape of the molecule. It forms something called a double helix. It's like a spiral staircase. And so our DNA molecules are made of smaller parts that we call nucleotides. Okay? And a nucleotide has 3 parts. It has a phosphate group connected to a sugar. It's a simple sugar. Okay, it's called deoxyribose. And then there's what we call a nitrogen base. Logan, look, we're not done yet. We're in the middle of notes, and there's things here that you're supposed to be writing down. So we have a phosphate group, we have a sugar,
Oh.
and a nitrogen base. Those three parts make up a single nucleotide.
I was trying to remember that.
And our DNA molecule is made of thousands of these connected one to the other into a large molecule that we call DNA. And it forms this unique shape. It's called the double helix. And the DNA molecule has two sides to it. If you think of it like a ladder, you have the sides of the ladder, which are made of the sugars and the phosphate, and then the rungs of the ladder are made of these nitrogen bases. So the DNA molecule has two sides to it. And we often will draw a diagram that shows it looking like this: the phosphate, the sugar, and then the base. There's 4 possible bases that you can have in DNA. The names are adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And they always match up with each other in a certain way. Adenine, which we often abbreviate with the letter A, always matches up with the letter T, which stands for thymine. A and T go together. Apples and trees, cars and garages. Cytosine and guanine always match up together. Okay. And the shape of the DNA molecule is this double-stranded spiral staircase. It's called the double helix. I told you earlier last week, was discovered, the structure of the DNA molecule was discovered by 2 scientists in the 1950s, Watson and Crick, along with help from a woman, Rosalind Franklin, pictures of it. They discovered the structure of DNA. And tomorrow in class, you're going to be making some models of DNA to help you understand how the parts are connected and how they link up with each other. We'll stop there for today.